12 days in September 1989 took 3 airliners on 3 continents. Nothing linked those flights except the calendar. The year around them ran the same way, and what it left behind rewrote how airliners are certified and inspected. Don't forget to subscribe to Terra Obscura. The forward cargo door of an early Boeing 747 sat flush in the skin of the fuselage. Steel hooks along its lower edge closed around pins in the doorframe, and small aluminum plates slid across the mouths of those hooks so they could not turn back. Boeing had known since the mid-70s that the aluminum was soft enough for the steel to shove aside, and it offered airlines a thicker version. Most skipped it. United Airlines Flight 811 left Honolulu just before 2 in the morning on the 24th of February 1989, bound for Auckland and then Sydney. Hawaii was the last American ground it would see. Captain David Cronin kept the seatbelt signs on because of storms out over the Pacific. He had 337 passengers behind him and 18 crew. 17 minutes out and climbing through 22,000 feet, the crew heard a dull thump. A second later, the right side of the airplane opened. The cargo door tore away and took a section of fuselage with it from the holdup past the window line. The floor gave way beneath 5 rows of seats on the right, and 9 passengers went out with them. Debris swept back into the 2 engines on that wing and shredded their fan blades. When the pilots reached for oxygen, there was none because the supply had gone with the door. Captain Cronin pushed the airplane into an emergency descent and turned back toward the island. The flight engineer went down to the main deck and came back saying the right side was open. All 3 told air traffic control an explosive device had detonated on board. Well above landing weight, they dumped fuel the whole way in with 1 engine shut down and another failing. Captain Cronin held nearly full left rudder to keep the nose pointed at Hawaii, and the damaged flaps put the approach across the threshold at 190 knots. The 747 touched down, stopped on the runway, and all 346 people still aboard walked off it. The door itself lay somewhere on the floor of the Pacific, so nobody could read where the hooks and plates had been when they let go. 2 years earlier, a Pan Am 747 had climbed out of London and failed to pressurize. On the ground, its forward cargo door sat unlatched with the locking handle still turned to locked. Boeing and Pan Am concluded that a ground handler had cranked the hooks open with a socket wrench and bent the plates aside. Boeing issued its most urgent grade of service bulletin, and the Federal Aviation Administration made the reinforcement mandatory 11 months later. Operators got at least 18 months to comply. United had done the work on 6 of its 31 747s. The airplane flying to Auckland was booked into the shop for April. In April 1990, the National Transportation Safety Board published its findings. It concluded that somebody on the ground had damaged the plates during an earlier manual opening, and that the damage later let the door be locked while it was not properly latched. Kevin and Susan Campbell did not accept that. Their son Lee had been in one of the seats that left the airplane, and from New Zealand they reached a different answer from the same evidence. A fault in the door's own wiring, they argued, was likelier than a handler turning a wrench dozens of times without noticing the locking handle. That door had failed to open or close on its electrical switch several times in the months before. The safety board, the regulator, Boeing and United agreed in July 1990 to split the cost of a search. The United States Navy did the searching, and the door came up in 2 pieces from 14,200 feet on the 26th of September and the 1st of October. The plates carried no earlier damage. Someone had moved them into the locked position while the hooks were properly closed, and the hooks had then rotated open and forced the plates aside. That sequence was impossible under the explanation published 6 months before. Confirmation came at a gate in New York in June 1991. Technicians on another United 747 pulled a plug from a junction box and put it back, and the cargo door started opening by itself. Inside, a kinked conduit were wires rubbed bare. In 1992, the safety board withdrew its own report and issued a replacement. A faulty switch or damaged wiring in the door control system had driven the hooks toward open after the door was shut and before the airplane left the ground. The Campbells had argued for an electrical fault rather than a man with a wrench, and on that much, the safety board now agreed with them. Flight 5050 existed only because of cancellations. Weather and traffic had jammed the United States Northeast all day, and by the evening of the 20th of September, USAir had scrubbed the crew's trip to Norfolk and told them to take the empty 737-400 down to Charlotte. Then the plan changed again. Passengers stranded by another cancellation went on board, which pushed the crew toward the edge of their duty limits, and the captain said so at the time. They had come into LaGuardia in New York from Baltimore that afternoon. The captain had held command for 2 months, with 140 hours in the left seat. His first officer had 22 hours in the aircraft, and this was to be his first unsupervised line trip. While the airplane sat at the gate, several people came up to the cockpit, among them a Pan Am captain riding as a passenger who took the jump seat. The rudder trim on that model was a blade switch on the center pedestal between the pilots, and jump seat riders who put a foot up on the pedestal could knock it out of position. The flight recorder had the trim at neutral when the airplane arrived. By the time the engines started again, it was at its left limit, 15.9 degrees. The before takeoff checklist called for stabilizer and trim. The pilots read the stabilizer and stopped there. On the way to runway 31, the rudder pedals were sitting more than 11 centimeters out of line with each other, and neither man mentioned it. The first officer was flying. He reached for the takeoff mode switches and hit the auto throttle disconnect instead. So when he pressed the right ones, nothing happened and he pushed the levers up by hand. Neither engine reached full takeoff power, and the captain said he would set it properly but never did. As the speed built, the trim began pulling the nose left and the first officer held it straight with right rudder without saying he was doing it. The captain was working the tiller, the small steering wheel beside his seat, which loses authority as an airplane speeds up. At 62 knots, one of the nose tires came off its rim with a bang, and rumbling started at 91. Neither man suggested stopping. Then the captain said he had the steering. He meant the first officer should take it, and the first officer understood the opposite, so both of them let go, and the airplane swung left across the runway. 4.5 seconds later, the captain pulled the throttles back and abandoned the takeoff. He had not looked at the airspeed. Nobody had been calling it out, because the confusion over who was steering had swallowed the standard call-outs. The speed past which a takeoff should not be abandoned had been worked out before departure at 125 knots, and they were doing 130 when he made the call. He then used the brakes unevenly to straighten the airplane rather than to stop it, and full braking did not arrive until 5.5 seconds after the decision. Nobody had armed the automatic braking before departure. The 737 left the end of the runway at 34 knots, dropped off the deck, and struck the wooden stanchion that carried the approach lights out into Bowery Bay. The fuselage broke into 3 pieces, and 2 passengers seated at the brake did not survive. One of the forward doors would not open, and another had to be shut when water came through it. The people who went out of the right side doors landed in the bay with nothing to float on, because flights that stay within 50 nautical miles of shore were not required to carry life jackets. 2 of the flight attendants went in after them. Fire trucks reached the runway end inside 90 seconds, and the last 2 trapped passengers came out an hour and a half later. Runway 31 was 2,140 meters long. The airplane needed about 1,730 of them to reach that speed and stop again on wet pavement. And the rain that night was light enough that the National Transportation Safety Board ruled out hydroplaning and found the drainage good. The engines had never reached full power, and the captain had rejected above the limiting speed. The delay in getting to full braking took what was left. Afterwards, the board collected at least 90 informal reports of that same trim switch ending up at its left limit before departure. Boeing replaced the blade with a round knob behind a guard. 2 years before the crash, the board had asked the Federal Aviation Administration to stop airlines putting a brand new captain and a brand new first officer in the same cockpit. The regulator recommended it instead of requiring it. Neither of these men had been trained in how a crew is supposed to talk to each other under pressure, and that training became mandatory in the United States only in 1994. Investigators wanted to interview the 2 pilots on the morning after the crash. The pilots' union had moved them to a location it would not disclose, and the board did not reach them for 44 hours, by which point any blood or urine sample was worthless. In its report, the board wrote that this bordered on interference with a federal investigation. Santa Maria is the southeastern corner of the Azores, a Portuguese island group out in the Atlantic west of Lisbon. Through the 50s and 60s, aircraft crossing the ocean had to put down there for fuel, and the field handled dozens of movements a day. Longer-range jets removed the need, and the traffic went away with it. By 1989, the island had fewer than 6,000 people, and only a few airlines still used the runway. One of them was Independent Air, an American charter operator running 2 707s on work for tour companies. Italian firms hired it to carry holidaymakers to the Caribbean, and a 707 could not make that crossing in one leg, so Santa Maria went into the schedule as a fuel stop. On the 8th of February, 1989, the airplane left Bergamo in Italy at 10:04 as Flight 1851, with 137 Italian passengers and 7 American crew aboard. The island had 2 radio beacons, and the approach was supposed to begin at the one sighted off the north end of the field. The published chart did not say so. Aircraft coming in from the east therefore steered for the other beacon, and a straight line to it passed over the top of Pico Alto, the highest ground on Santa Maria at 1,925 feet. That did not matter, because the minimum safe altitude printed on the chart was 3,000 feet and cleared the mountain by either route. In the tower, a trainee was working the approach and tower positions together. He had been on the job 5 months, and his supervisor was answering telephones. Neither controller had been in the tower at all until 12:44 that afternoon. The airport had no radar, so nothing on the ground could show them how low an arriving airplane was. At 13:56, the controller cleared the flight down to 3,000 feet and passed a pressure setting for the altimeters. The first officer read the altitude back as 2,000. He was still speaking when the controller keyed his own microphone to add an instruction, and on that radio, a transmitting station cannot receive. The two messages canceled each other. The controller heard only the pressure figure read back, and the crew missed the end of his instruction. The captain said to make it 3. The first officer set the altitude reminder to 2,000 anyway. They had skipped the approach briefing, which is where the 3,000-foot figure would have come up. The pressure setting was wrong as well. 12 minutes earlier, the same controller had passed 1019. Now he passed 1027, and the real figure was close to the first one. Pressure does not move that far that fast in ordinary weather. The first officer asked whether he had heard the number right. The captain confirmed it, and they wound the altimeters to it. Investigators noted that someone from the cabin had come up to the cockpit and that the crew were holding an unrelated conversation through the descent. The airplane leveled off at what its instruments showed as 2,000 feet and went into cloud. At 14:08, the warning system that watches for rising ground began calling for a climb. It ran for 7 seconds, and neither pilot spoke or moved the controls. The 707 struck a ridge below the summit of Pico Alto at 1,795 feet and broke apart against a wall beside the road that runs up the mountain. Nobody on board survived, and it remains the worst air disaster in Portugal's history. Portugal's Civil Aviation Authority wanted the 7 seconds explained, and it asked America's National Transportation Safety Board to examine how Independent Air trained its pilots. The airline was not teaching crews how to respond to that warning, although American regulations required it. Independent Air owned no simulators and rented time on another operator's 707s, which were rigged differently. At the speeds and descent rates Independent Air used, the warning went off during ordinary approaches in those machines. Instructors switched it off or told the students to disregard it. The airport's published information had not been revised since 1962 and carried decades of handwritten amendments on top of it. Afterwards, Portugal clarified which beacon the approach began at and raised the minimum safe altitude over the island. Radar came to Santa Maria later. Italy banned Independent Air from its airspace 2 days after the crash. An Azorian carrier canceled its contract before the month was out, and the tour operators followed. The company stopped flying in November 1990. The Convair 580 that the Norwegian charter operator Partnair flew out of Oslo had been built in 1953 and had changed hands 10 times. United Airlines took it new, and General Motors ran it as a company aircraft. A Honduran carrier had it until a nose gear collapse sent it to an American repair shop. More owners followed, and it was sitting derelict in Florida when a Canadian firm bought it and made it airworthy again. Partnair became the 11th owner in 1986. By 1989, Partnair was in serious financial trouble. On the 8th of September, the Norwegian Civil Aviation Authority had told the country's airports to hold Partnair aircraft until unpaid fees were settled, and Flight 394 was delayed while the first officer went out and paid the catering bill in cash. The shipping company Wilhelmsen had chartered it to take 50 of its staff to a ship naming in Hamburg. With the crew, there were 55 people on board when they left at 3:59 that afternoon. The airplane carried a small turbine generator in the tail, an aftermarket fitting that had gone in and out several times over the decades. The list of equipment that had to be working before departure predated it and said that both electrical generators must be serviceable, although the airplane by then had 3. The left one had been faulty for 2 days, so the crew ran the tail turbine in flight to cover it, which no procedure on the Convair allowed outside an emergency. They reached 22,000 feet at 4:23. 11 minutes later, the heading went unstable, and the vibration in the airframe grew. The pilots lost the rudder, and the airplane swung hard left, came back right for 3 seconds and rolled onto its back. The rudder tore away, and in the dive that followed the tail, came off along with the wingtips and parts of the cabin. What was left went into the Skagerrak, 18 kilometers north of Hirtshals in Denmark, and all 55 were lost. Norway ran the investigation because the wreck lay just outside Danish waters and the airplane was on the Norwegian register. Salvage crews lifted the pieces off the seabed one at a time, and investigators rebuilt the tail in a hangar. The cockpit recorder was no help to them, since a modified relay had cut its power when the crew set takeoff thrust, and the tape had stopped on the runway. The flight recorder was an old design that scratched 5 traces onto a spool of metal foil. The altitude line was sometimes drawn twice, which could only happen if the arm holding the stylus was vibrating far beyond what the manufacturer allowed. The spool held months of flying, and the double line ran through most of it. It stopped after a major overhaul that summer, and 9 flights later it came back worse than before. Partnair sent its heavy maintenance to a Norwegian firm, which had no capacity that summer, and passed the work to the Canadian company that used to own the airplane. The fin was held to the fuselage at 4 points. The mechanics ran their ultrasound test with those bolts still in place, which the procedure did not allow, then found one worn out and replaced it. They left the other 3 where they were. A Norwegian inspector refused to sign the paperwork, but the check was not formally due for another 3,200 flight hours, so everyone agreed to redo it later. All 3 remaining bolts came up from the seabed visibly worn, with enough play in them for the whole fin to shift sideways by nearly a millimeter. Testing showed they had never been heat-treated properly, and were about 60% as hard as the specification required. The forward mount of the tail turbine had broken in 2 from metal fatigue before the flight, and the 2 halves had been striking each other for some time. That turbine spins at 40,000 revolutions a minute. With its front mount gone, it could rock in place, and the fin above it was already moving on its loose bolts. The 2 motions reinforced each other, and the oscillation grew instead of dying away. The rudder swung past its stops until its counterweights broke through the panels behind it, then jammed hard over and came off. Fragments of those panels were the small object Copenhagen radar kept painting for nearly 40 minutes as they drifted down from 22,000 feet. The bolts were counterfeit. The Canadian company had fitted them new in 1986 and kept no inventory records before 1987, so they could have come from any of 5 suppliers. When the American regulator went looking afterwards, it found a trade in worn and rejected parts, dressed up with false paperwork, and forged inspector signatures. Nobody ever established who made them out. Through the 1980s, South Korean construction firms held some of the largest civil engineering contracts in Libya. The men who built those sites went out on rotation and came home on leave, and Korean Air ran a weekly shuttle for them. It left Seoul and reached Tripoli by way of Bangkok and Jeddah, better than 20 hours end to end. On the 27th of July 1989, that shuttle was a DC-10, carrying 181 passengers and 18 crew. All but 10 of the passengers were construction workers heading back to job sites in Libya and elsewhere in the region. 7 Libyans and 3 Japanese were among them. Tripoli was under fog when they came in. Visibility on the field was down to about 100 feet in places, and the instrument landing system for runway 27 was unserviceable, so the only procedure left to the crew was a beacon approach. An hour earlier, an Aeroflot crew had been given the same weather and taken their airplane to Malta. For about 15 minutes on the way in, the crew were out of radio contact with the tower, so nobody on the ground was in a position to tell them where they had got to. They kept ascending past the altitude they were permitted to reach without sight of the runway. Just after 7:30 in the morning, the DC-10 clipped 2 houses and several cars and came down in an orchard short of the threshold. It broke apart and burned. 74 people on board were lost and 6 more on the ground, and 113 of the survivors went to hospital. All 3 pilots lived. The captain was pulled out with burns and light injuries and gave his account to investigators from a hospital bed. Korean Air's chairman flew to Tripoli with a task force of 75 people, doctors and medical equipment among them, to bring the Korean dead and injured home. In Seoul, about 100 relatives marched on Kimpo Airport when their demand to be flown out to the crash site was not met. The company that had built the airplane was already dealing with the loss of another DC-10 in the United States 8 days earlier, and it could not find out what had happened to this one. A McDonnell Douglas spokesman said the United States had no diplomatic representation in Libya and that early attempts to get facts had gone nowhere. The American Safety Board and the American regulator stayed out as well. Libya ran the investigation through its own Civil Aviation Authority and brought in French specialists to read the recorders, with officials from the South Korean Transport Ministry sitting in for the airline. 2 days after the crash, before the investigation had reported anything, the Libyan state news agency published its own account. The captain had been warned about the fog 15 minutes before he reached the field. The Aeroflot crew had turned away on the same information, and by international practice, the decision to land belongs to the captain alone. The final report came out the following year and put the cause on the crew for continuing a beacon approach below the minimum in that visibility. In December 1990, a Libyan court convicted the captain of negligence and gave him 2 years. The first officer got 18 months suspended. The colorful 11 started as a project in Amsterdam to keep boys from the city's Surinamese neighborhoods out of trouble, and it grew until professional players of Surinamese descent were turning out for it. In June 1989, the organizers set up a 4-team tournament in Paramaribo. Most of the first-choice players could not get permission from their Dutch clubs, so 18 of the squad's reserves flew out instead. They boarded Suriname Airways flight 764 at Schiphol 12 hours late on a DC-8 that had been slow coming up from Miami. There were 187 people on the airplane. It left Amsterdam late on the 6th of June and was due into Zanderij, the airport that serves Paramaribo in Suriname, before dawn. The 3 men in the cockpit did not work for Suriname Airways. The country had few qualified pilots of its own, so the airline rented crews from a company in Miami on a contract it renewed every week. That company handled their training and their checks. Suriname Airways provided the airplane and the cabin crew, and its records did not even carry the captain's name. He was 66, 6 years over the age limit for an airline pilot. Runway 10 at Zanderij had an instrument landing system that had been switched out of service the previous December, and the crew knew it. They expected to fly the beacon and distance approach instead, which steps down at set ranges from the field. Then, the 4 o'clock weather came in with visibility down from 6,000 meters to 900, and that approach needed 2,300. The instrument landing approach needed 800 meters. The system was officially unserviceable, but the transmitter was still on, and the first officer pointed out that they could pick up the signal. The captain agreed to use it. The controller then cleared them for the beacon approach. The first officer read that clearance back, and the crew flew the instrument approach anyway. The runway lights came up through the top of the fog, which made the field look nearer than it was, and gave the crew the impression they were high. The glide path needle said they were low. The first officer decided the needle was wrong because he knew the system was out of service, and told the captain to keep coming down. When the ground proximity warning began calling out the deviation, one of them pulled its circuit breaker and left it out. The lowest they were allowed to go on that approach was 260 feet. The captain took it to 200 and began to level off. An engine hit a tree 300 meters short of the threshold, with the airplane 82 feet above the ground. The outer right wing struck another tree and tore away, and the DC-8 rolled onto its back. The official report counted 9 survivors out of 187. 15 of the 18 footballers were lost. The country had about 400,000 people at the time, and it was the deadliest crash South America had seen up to that point. A flight test carried out days afterwards found the glide path transmitter working normally, so the reading the first officer had dismissed had been correct. The Commission of Inquiry found that the captain's most recent proficiency check, done that April, had been flown in a 5-seat light twin rather than a DC-8. The Maryland company that signed it off had a name very like that of a well-known American cargo airline. The first officer was flying under a name that was not his, on an American certificate obtained with a British license number that Britain's Civil Aviation Authority said had never existed. That certificate had already been revoked after an accident in Texas. 4 months before Paramaribo, the captain had landed hard in Lisbon and damaged both the landing gear and the runway. Suriname Airways banned him from its flights. He was back on them within weeks, because the Miami company assigned crews through an intermediary, and the airline's managers did not track who was actually flying. The DC-8 was registered in the United States and stopped in Miami on its schedule. The Federal Aviation Administration could have inspected the airplane and the licenses of the men flying it any time it sat on the ground there. Its standing policy was to leave foreign carriers alone, so that American airlines would not be treated the same way abroad. The National Transportation Safety Board found the Miami company was one of many brokering pilots to foreign airlines while nobody checked them. In 1993, the regulator began requiring foreign operators to hand over crew dates of birth, and in 1994 it started demanding proof that their pilots were qualified. Every Boeing 737 ever built carries the same pilot license. A crew qualified on one version moves to another by sitting a differences course, and in 1989, that course ran under 2 days and needed no simulator time. The 2 pilots working British Midland's Belfast route had sat theirs in October and had 76 hours between them on the 737-400. The airline taught them the new cockpit displays in a classroom. Flight 92 left Heathrow in England on the evening of the 8th of January, 1989, bound for Belfast with 118 passengers and 8 crew. 13 minutes out, and climbing through 28,300 feet, the outer panel of a fan blade broke off inside the left engine. The fan went out of balance and the airplane began shaking hard enough to slide objects off tray tables. Burning smells reached the flight deck. Compressed air surged forward through the engine in a series of bangs, and unburned fuel lit in the exhaust. So passengers down the left side watched flame come out of the back of the engine in bursts. The pilots had no view of either engine from where they sat. The captain took control and looked at the engine displays without getting a clear answer out of them. He asked which one it was, and the first officer began to say left, corrected himself, and said right. On the 737s the captain had flown before, cabin air came from the right engine, and the smell was reaching him from behind. On the 400, a share of that air came from the left engine as well, which the differences course had not covered. He told the first officer to throttle it back. The auto throttle had already pulled the left engine back on its own, seconds earlier, to stop the surging, so the bangs stopped at the moment the first officer's hand moved on the right thrust lever. Both men now believed the right engine was the failing one, and they shut it down and turned for East Midlands Airport. The captain went on the public address to settle the cabin and said the right engine had been closed off. Several passengers on the left side had spent the last few minutes watching flame come out of the engine beside them. They kept it to themselves. The cabin crew missed the announcement altogether because they were busy readying the cabin for an emergency landing. 7 minutes after the failure, the captain began going back over what indications they had actually seen. Air traffic control came in with a new heading before he finished the sentence, and he never returned to it. Descending through 3,000 feet with the runway ahead, he added power on the left engine to hold the approach. The broken piece of fan blade had been sitting in the engine's inlet lining since the failure, and the extra airflow pulled it back through the machine, which tore the engine apart from the inside. At 900 feet, the airplane had no thrust at all, and the first officer could not relight the right engine in the time left. They crossed a field and took down a stand of trees. The airplane bounced off the embankment beside the M1 motorway and cleared the southbound carriageway before it struck the far bank nose first. It broke into 3 pieces 900 meters short of the runway threshold. 39 people died in the impact and 8 more in hospital, the last of them nearly 3 weeks later. 74 of the survivors were seriously hurt. The seats themselves had held. The floor track underneath them failed instead. So occupied rows pitched forward and tore out by the roots, and the people in them went headfirst into the debris ahead. The Air Accidents Investigation Branch measured a deceleration in the second impact harder than anything the airframe and its fittings had been certified to withstand. A 2-month-old fan blade should not crack from fatigue at all. Investigators traced this one to a vibration that only appeared in the engine above 27,000 feet at high power, with the nose well up. The manufacturer had certified the engine on the ground and used special equipment to reach speeds it would otherwise see only at altitude. Real climbing airflow behaves differently, and the vibration never showed itself in the test. The same blade fractured twice more that June, once on a Dan Air 737-400 and once on another British Midland aircraft. Both crews identified the failed engine and landed. Britain grounded the type and ordered the blades pulled off every one of those engines. The fleet's flying in 1989 covered 30 years of engineering. A passenger could board a 737-400 that had come off the line the previous autumn, or a 707 from the early 60s, and both were certified and selling seats on scheduled routes. That 737-400 had entered service in September 1988. Inside 12 months, 2 of them were gone, one into a motorway embankment in England, and one into the water beyond a New York runway. 11 years after the United States deregulated its airlines, the pieces of an operation could be bought separately. One charter company had no simulators of its own and rented time in another airlines. One national carrier rented its cockpit crews by the week from a company in Miami and did not have the captain's name on file. The American regulator, meanwhile, had a standing policy of leaving foreign carriers alone on its own ramps so that American Airlines would not be inspected abroad. Several of that year's reports read like audits. Investigators found a chart that had not been revised since 1962, and a license number a national authority said had never existed. One engine had been certified on a test rig because the vibration that broke it only appeared at altitude. One checklist line named 2 systems, and the crew read one of them. Most of the people on those flights were traveling for ordinary reasons. Korean construction crews rode a weekly shuttle out to a job site and back. A Dutch football squad was flying to a tournament, and a charter full of Italian holidaymakers was crossing to the Caribbean. The passengers who ended up in the water at LaGuardia were on a flight that only existed because 2 others had been canceled. 2 countries recorded the worst air disaster in their history that year, 4 months apart. Britain grounded a whole variant until its fan blades came out of every engine. Portugal settled which beacon an approach began at and lifted the minimum altitude over an island. Boeing rewired the warning lights on cargo doors to read the latches rather than the handle. From 1993, foreign carriers flying into the United States had to prove who was sitting in their cockpits. And from 1994, American crews had to be trained in how to talk to each other under pressure. The rudder trim on a 737 used to be a flat blade switch on the console between the pilots, low enough that somebody riding in the jump seat could knock it out of position with a foot. Boeing replaced it with a round knob behind a guard. That change came out of one wet night at LaGuardia in September 1989.